Hello, everyone. This is going to be 19.1 Safe for Democracy, the United States in World War I. So, in this one, we are actually going to be focusing just on the build up to World War I, where we're going to be focusing mainly on American imperialism, big stick diplomacy, dollar diplomacy, and moral imperialism throughout the Western Hemisphere building up to the First World War. And we're going to start with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt in 1910, his famous Man in the Arena speech, where he said, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how strong the man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds? Who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions? Who spends himself in a worthy cause? Who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." This definitely shows Roosevelt as a man of action, although some of his actions, just like those of Taft and Wilson, also drew serious question marks as well. So, American imperialism and progressivism were sort of intersecting and crisscrossing in interesting ways in the early part of the 20th century. We were by far one of the smaller imperialist nations. We did not have the huge tracts of land that England or France or even Italy or other countries had. However, we had picked up a few things in the Panama Canal, which we're going to look at soon. We acquired the U.S. Virgin Islands during this time after the Spanish American War. And although we had not uh, taken over a lot of different places, we'd taken over a few, we were still a very powerful and influential and wealthy country. And that influence was something that we could spread even if we weren't spreading it militarily. So, when America first appears on the world stage, it wasn't necessarily only our army that was doing it. It was also our economy that was spreading, our culture, and our intellectual power that was spreading as well. So, during the time before World War I, American exports were one of the big things that we were seeing going around the country. Not necessarily our army or our navy, but our goods. And they dominated foreign markets as far as Great Britain. And hundreds of thousands of Americans were also traveling every single year. A lot of these travelers went to different countries, they picked up different ideas. They invested in foreign causes, for instance, the fight for Irish independence and the plight of the Jewish people in Russia who were being oppressed and thrown out and killed by the Tsar in what are called pogroms. However, our rhetoric, our speaking for the time period was more about the idea that we were exporting not just goods, but also American values and American democracies. And that even when we had to get our military involved, it was still a progressive idea. We were doing it to spread freedom across the world. So here is, for instance, Teddy Roosevelt taking the Tsar of Russia to task for kicking out the Jewish people, including those who were carrying a heavy load of oppression and murder on their backs. Now, this idea was really important to Woodrow Wilson in his belief of what he called liberal internationalism. This is the idea that political freedom was essential for economic freedom, and we should be worried about both. We should be worried about exporting our goods, but when we export our goods, we should also be exporting our values. And if America wanted to grow economically, we should also grow as a broker of peace. And this belief in the necessity of American intervention would really be tested when we get to the World War One. We said our job was to make America safe for democracy and to spread American values. That's going to be sorely tested with American lives when we get to the First World War. Uh, and also when America finally decides to get involved in it, too, which takes us a few years. However, in order to spread progressive American values, some also argued that during the First World War, we lose them at home. We will get to that after this section. So let's start with this time period of American intervention, all leading up to the big American intervention, which is World War I. The progressive presidents had all expanded the power of the federal government, both here in America and abroad. And at first, this was restricted mainly to the Western Hemisphere. This is all tied to the idea of the Monroe Doctrine back in the 1820s, and how the Western Hemisphere was sort of our territory, our jurisdiction, and we had the right to defend it, especially from European aggressors who were coming in. And so, in the first few years of the 20th century, American troops were sent to the Caribbean over 20 times. We were heavily involved in a lot of these Central and South American and Caribbean countries in a variety of ways. Oftentimes, this was to make sure that American bankers and American money would be repaid and that our investments were safe during this time. So, here, for example, is Teddy Roosevelt taking his big fleet of navy that he created around Central and Middle America and using it to sort of do our bidding. So, one of the places we did this, in the first place that we're going to look at, is Teddy Roosevelt, who viewed the world in simple terms. Much as he said there were good and bad trusts, he basically said there were also good and bad countries, and he judged the goodness and badness of a country based upon their civilization, whether they were civilized or not civilized. And he believed it was the job of the civilized nations, and he believed America was at the forefront of civilization. It is the job of civilized countries to establish order, to make sure that things are going the way of civilization. Further abroad, Roosevelt even intervened as an unbiased third party in the Russo-Japanese War between Russia and Japan. In general, Roosevelt was more on the side of the Russians, but he also liked how the Japanese were advancing themselves, modernizing, and things like that. But he said, you know what, I'm going to step in, I'm going to be a neutral third party, and I'm going to help bring an end to the Russo-Japanese War of the early 20th century. And in doing so, he actually got the Nobel Peace Prize for this. So here's Roosevelt and some Russian and Japanese diplomats. Closer to home in the Western Hemisphere, Roosevelt was more than willing to intervene forcefully and directly. You can see this in what is called his big stick diplomacy, which is based on one of his favorite proverbs, which is speak softly and carry a big stick, which more or less means that it's all well and good to talk about diplomacy and to be diplomatic and to, use your words. However, make sure you have a big gun behind your back, ready to back up those words if necessary. And he did this in the Caribbean and in Latin America, first with Panama, which wasn't even a country yet. Panama was a part of Colombia. However, we wanted to build a canal through Panama that would link the Atlantic and Pacific. Now, the Colombian government was not willing to give us that land. It used to be French, and then we tried to buy it, and Colombia said no. And so instead, we decided that we were going to help foment a Panamanian revolution, and we would defend it with an American gunboat that basically made sure that the Colombians could not attack the Panamanians who were rebelling against them. Shortly after the Panamanian Revolution was successful, this new country of Panama gave control of the Panama Canal to America. This is called the Panama Canal Zone, the area not only of the canal, but the area surrounding it for about 10 miles as well, which we used to create a lot of American areas of influence. Now, the canal did not happen overnight. We were taking over a job that the French had started, and they'd lost a lot of money and a lot of manpower trying to build this canal. We took over, and it took years of work. It took tens of thousands of foreign laborers, many of them from the Caribbean. It took the deaths of at least 10,000 workers due to the heat, due to disease, due to malaria, due to mosquitoes, due to many things before it was done. And when it was done in 1914, it was a great victory for American trade. The Panama Canal cut the time required for ships to cross from one ocean to the other by thousands of miles and days and weeks of dangerous sailing. And also, the Panama Canal stayed in American hands until the year 2000. So we were making quite a bit of money off the canal as well. So here is where the Panama Canal is in what is called the Isthmus of Panama. We can see the different areas of the canal and also the locks, which we see water rise and lower in order to get ships to go up and down in elevation. We also see the railroad that connects it and the Panama Canal zone around the canal itself. Here is Teddy Roosevelt at the Panama Canal helping to build it. This is also the first time that we have a sitting president leave the country. And here's what the canal looks like today as well. Now, Roosevelt's actions in Panama are part of something, this is important, this is something you're going to want to know. This is called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So you might remember corollaries from geometry class, where it's sort of like, if this law is true, then this law is true as well. And Roosevelt announced it in 1904, basically the idea that we could preemptively intervene if it looked like a Central American or South American country was about to get into trouble with the European countries. We could jump in before it happened in order to protect our investments within these countries. And so he basically said that the U.S. had the right to be an international police power within the Western Hemisphere. Now, early on in Roosevelt's administration, we did this in Venezuela. Venezuela was being blockaded by several European nations, all looking for the money that their banks were owed. And so instead, Roosevelt convinced these European navies to withdraw and sort of let us take the lead. He also, however, sent the American army, to the Dominican Republic in order to make sure that American debts were paid, that basically they would pay money to American banks that they were in debt to. Roosevelt also sent troops to Cuba for over 3 years to oversee an election that we thought went the wrong way. He promoted the idea that American fruit companies should dominate the economies of these Central and South American countries. So he's promoting military imperialism, economic imperialism, cultural imperialism throughout Central and South America. So here is Roosevelt using the big gun of the Monroe Doctrine to scare the heck out of Europe to stop attacking Santo Domingo. Now, Taft did some of this as well. Taft was not immune to sending troops overseas. For instance, he sent American troops to Nicaragua to help keep an American-friendly administration in power. However, he also used a new idea to sort of ensure American power throughout the Western Hemisphere, and that is economic imperialism, what Taft would call dollar diplomacy. The idea of dollar diplomacy is don't send in troops, send in loans, send in economic investment, and that is a great way to make sure that these up-and-coming countries are going to be on our side, is if we send them money and not troops instead. You can use the threat of military force if necessary, as we see in this political cartoon, where we're sending all these American businesses overseas, and he says you've got the government behind you, including the big stick if necessary. Lastly, we have Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was an anti-imperialist, or at least not as much of an imperialist as Taft and Roosevelt. He even had a Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, who was an avid and outspoken anti-imperialist. However, he still did feel the need to intervene occasionally throughout Latin America and South America. He promised Latin Americans their political independence and their economic independence too. He basically said we're going to take less of a hand in everything. He still saw the U.S. as the leader of how to create a good democracy in this 20th century world, and that he thought we should be sort of the lead instructor in how to create a good, solid, long-lasting democracy. And he thought the best way to export American morality and American democracy and American beliefs is by also exporting American goods. So, Wilson promised to keep out of foreign affairs. He did use what he called moral imperialism occasionally and did get directly involved with some uh, Latin American affairs. So, for instance, he believed that a U.S. foreign policy should be guided by morality and be focused on spreading democracy. However, at times, we had to use our army to spread our democracy. So, for instance, in 1915, Wilson sent American troops to Hispaniola, the island of Hispaniola, which has both Haiti and the Dominican Republic on it. We sent troops to Haiti in 1915. We sent troops to the Dominican Republic in 1916. Both in order to support American ideals. We stayed in Haiti till the 1920s and in the Dominican Republic until the 1930s. And while we did build roads and schools, we were also promoting a military authoritarian dictatorship as well, which was not the moral democracy that we were talking about. The biggest diplomatic problem for Wilson was the country of Mexico, where there were a series of revolutions and coups and violent overthrows. In 1913, Victoriano Huerta assassinated the previous leader of Mexico and took control with the help of American oil manufacturers, but not the help of the American government. Wilson was actually stunned when this happened, and so he sent troops to Mexico to make sure that Huerta didn't grow in power too much. However, when we landed in Mexico, we were viewed by Mexicans as aggressors and sort of they were angry at us. They were not like, thank you for saving us. They were very upset with us. So here is Victoriano Huerta. Eventually, Huerta fled the country, and this power vacuum that he left led to a civil war between several different groups, many of them which were sort of grassroots political movements of Mexican peasants, like Emiliano Zapata, demanding land reform, taking land away from the rich, wealthy landowners and giving it to the poor instead. However, Wilson was not in favor of Zapata. He was in favor of the more economically conservative and stable candidate Venustiano Carranza. Wilson, with the approval of Carranza, actually sent American troops to Mexico, basically along the U.S.-Mexican border, in order to try and capture a rebel leader named Francisco Pancho Villa. All these guys were assassinated a few years later, by the way. However, our interventions really showed that this whole idea of intervening around the world can be very dangerous. We're not always welcome wherever we are, and there's not always a great exit plan as well. So, making the world safe for democracy was a bit of a thing sometimes. So, here is Woodrow Wilson, the professor, teaching Mexico, Nicaragua, and Venezuela what it means to be a good moral democracy in this situation. You notice Mexico has something stuffed in its pocket, which is a paper that says how to create a revolution.